أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. All the praise and glory belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We thank Him, we seek His guidance and ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge with Allah from the sins and evils of our own souls. Whomsoever Allah guides is rightly guided, and whomsoever Allah leaves astray will find no guidance. And I bear witness there is no God but Allah, and Prophet Muhammad is the servant and the final prophet. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. O ye who believe, be conscious of Allah and do not die except as believers. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنهم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. O ye who believe, stand firmly with Allah as witness to fair dealings, and let not the hatred of others make you to commit wrong and move away from justice. Be just, that is next to piety, and Allah is well aware of all that you do. Dear brothers and sisters, and friends who are visiting us today, the topic for the khutbah is critical thinking and reason guided by faith. Before we dive into it, let me first define what I mean by critical thinking. Critical thinking is the ability to reason logically based on facts and circumstances to a given problem to arrive at a set of conclusions. The topic of faith and reason has been debated, particularly in the Western world, and it makes us somewhat uncomfortable, and it's for a reason. What happens when reason conflicts with faith? Does questioning faith or reasoning faith makes us less of a believer? After all, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Sami'na wa ata'na, we hear and we obey. Does it weaken our faith as a Muslim? So why did I choose this topic? There are two events that happened that prompted me to think about this topic. A month ago, during the month of Ramadan, on a weekend, on a Sunday afternoon, there was a bit of a commotion in my house, and my 10-year-old daughter Jenna was scrambling to look for a book, and she couldn't find it, and her mother was upset. And I said, let me help you find the book. Then I went on to ask her, tell me the title of the book. It happens to be a textbook in her class in 5th grade. The title of the book was Critical Thinking. Wow. In the 5th grade, where children are being taught critical thinking. Around the same time, a good friend of mine, Khaja, sent me an email, a bunch of us on an email thread, that essentially said, the title was The Muslim World's Decline in Science. And he went on to have a video of a guy by name Neil deGrasse. You can go watch the video called Naming Rights. Essentially, it says that if you're the first to invent something, you have the right to name it. And so if you look at the names of the stars, a lot of them are named of Arabic names because Muslims were the pioneers of the time. So the question then arises, why does Muslims, who were at the pinnacle of civilization for 5 centuries, lose their leadership and have not still recovered that? In spite of the fact that they made huge advances in astronomy, algorithms, mathematics, medicine, I can go on. So to understand our current situation, let me give you 2 facts. I looked at the number of patent applications that were filed in the year 2015. And I looked at the number of patents that were filed by Muslims in the Muslim countries, majority countries. There were about 11,000 patent applications that were filed by Muslim countries, half of which came from one country, Turkey. And it amounted to less than 1% of all the patents filed all over the world. Mind you, Muslims were 1.2 or 1.4 billion, accounting for 20% of the world's population. Let me give you another statistic. If you look at the Nobel Prizes, there are about 881 Nobel Prizes that have been given out. And Muslims account for 12 of them, 1.2%, 4%. And of that, half of them were peace prizes for Nobel Peace, which leaves about 6 or 7 prizes in art, science, and literature. Obviously, a lecture of this nature requires considerable research, and I wanted to give you the sources that I looked at so that you have a sense of where I'm picking the facts that I'm presenting today. First, there's a lecture by Tariq Ramadan, a well-known scholar. It's a video of it. You can find it, Critical Thinking for Muslims. There is an article on this topic by a scholar by name Ibrahim Musa from South Africa, who is a professor at Notre Dame University. There's a series of lectures by Sheikh Yasir Qadi. You can Google it or YouTube it, and look for printing press, coffee, Sheikh Yasir Qadi, you will find some of the things that I talk about today. There's also a very interesting book called The Islamic Enlightenment, The Struggle Between Faith and Reason by Christopher D. Balag. So before I start, I do want to ask myself and ask the question, why is it important to bring a topic of this nature in a forum like this? If you want to address the problems that we face, first we have to be somewhat self-critical. And there's plenty of examples of self-criticism or analysis in the Quran. Just look what Allah talks about after the Battle of Badr, analysis and critique of how Muslims performed. But after the loss in the Battle of Uhud, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala critiques what happened. Sort of self-criticism, teaching us that when something happens, we have to be introspective. But it does take a lot of courage for us to have self-criticism in a public domain, particularly when it relates to our own history. And last week I was in D.C., Washington, D.C., and I had a chance to visit the African American Museum. So the Smithsonian Museum, and if you didn't have a chance to go, I would highly encourage you to go. It chronicles the history of the African American sufferings through the centuries that they faced in this country. There are very few places you will go anywhere in the world where they publicly display the self-criticism of what the country went through, the people went through. If you have a chance to go to Mount Vernon in Washington, D.C., in George Washington's birthplace, if you go to Monticello, which is where Jefferson lived, After seeing all of that, there is a tour called the Slavery Tour. Here they are talking about the founders of the country, and they're talking about the hypocrisy in which they lived. So it's important for us to be self-critical so that we can learn from our history. So given the nature of this topic, let me present for you three things, sort of go to the end and tell you the three outcomes that I want, the conclusions I want to present, and let me then go back and talk about them. First is that critical thinking and reasoning is very much part of our faith, and I'll give you examples in the Quran and from the history of the Prophet ﷺ. Reasoning does not make us weaker in faith, it helps us to strengthen our faith. We have a unique perspective in the sense that, but is different than a Western perspective, is that reasoning for us is not absolute, but we are always guided by our faith. The legitimate concern we have is that, can we start reasoning about the existence of God, about the life after? As Tariq Ramadan would say, we believe in Islamic tenets not because they can be rationally proven, though many may be proven, but because we accept them as the starting point and as the basis of our faith. And I'll get into this in a minute. The second thing I want to say is that, what is the big deal if we don't have critical thinking? There are consequences. When we don't apply critical thinking, and I will show you that when we didn't apply critical thinking, that led to the decline of the civilization and where we are today. When we gave up reasoning and became dogmatic, we lost the leadership of the world and started a precipitous decline. The Western world took off, but the Muslims left and took the civilization to a whole new level through modernity. We are still far behind and trying to catch up. However, we have to strike a balance between embracing change and respecting our tradition. We cannot use tradition as a status quo to limit our progress, as it has happened many times. When I was visiting the African American Museum, at the sort of the end of the museum, there's a big board that had this quote that captured my attention. Past is only valuable to the extent it aids in the understanding of the present. Past is only of value to the extent that it aids in understanding of the present. The point of this was that even though we are seeing all of this, what happened to the African Americans, we have to remember and make sure that we don't repeat this again. In the same way, the museum was reflecting the story of the African Americans. We cannot gloat about our past without reflecting on what it means for us today. Interesting, ironically, it was Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century who argued that aql, which is the intellect, and naql, which is tradition, are as close in practice as they are in the way they sound. And finally, the third conclusion, let me make it personal. We live in a world of ideas. There are diverse points of view, both people within our own community and within the broader society. It is very important that we learn to hear the other perspective and engage within the community, whether it is people that follow a different madhab, perhaps even a Shia perspective, and with the broader society. When I say broader society, I don't mean those that support us, the liberals who come to our mosque to support us, who go to the airports when there's a Muslim ban, but also the 65 million Americans who voted for our President Trump, many of whom or most of whom are reasonable people, just like my neighbor. But they have a different point of view. We have to make sure that we engage with them, we understand their point of view, and figure out how we can communicate with them. We will be challenged with questions that make us uncomfortable. What if a child comes to us and says, why do I have to believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why do I have to pray 5 times a day? Are we going to shut them down? Or are we going to be patient and engage in a dialogue? Know that if we shut them down, it doesn't mean we have solved the problem, just that they're not going to come to us to discuss these issues. And it has led to a precipitous group of our youth who are either indifferent to our faith or who have decided to give up the faith. So these are the 3 things. One is Quran and Sunnah are very clear on critical thinking. Number 2, we have to make sure when we don't practice this critical thinking reason, it has led to our decline in civilization. Number 3, we have to engage and to be open to having a dialogue with people with different perspectives. Let me go to the first one, which is what does Sunnah have to say about critical thinking? And I want to quote to you the verse in Surah Al-Imran. إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاحْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Verily, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the alternation of the night and day, there are indeed signs for men of understanding. The word tafakkur, which means to reflect or contemplate, is mentioned in the Quran 17 times. In Surah Ar-Rum, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَلَمْ يَتَفَكَّرُوا فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ مَا خَلَقَ اللَّهُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَمَا بَيْنَهُمَا إِلَّا بِالْحَقِّ. Do they not contemplate within themselves that Allah has not created the heavens and the earth and what is between them except in truth? And in a hadith, Prophet ﷺ said, no act of worship is praiseworthy as reflection, tafakkur. So reflect on God's bounties and works of His power. If you read Surah Yasin, you will find many of times we read Surah Yasin for the dead. Ironically, it is full of lessons for the living. I was given a chance to do tafsir on Ramadan, and I was reading it. Really, it talks to our intellect. And if I just pick a few verses in the middle, from verses 36, سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يفعلون. Glory to Allah who created in pairs all things that the earth produces, as well as our own humankind and other things of which they have no knowledge. And the sign for them is the night. We take out from the day, and indeed they are plunged in darkness. As if Allah is drawing out like injection from night, and it becomes dark. And the sun runs its course for a period of time determined for him. That is a decree of Allah. And the moon we have measured for her mansions to traverse until she turns like an old withered lower part of her date palm. It is not permitted for the sun to catch up to the moon, nor can a night outstrip the day. Each swim along its own orbit according to the law of Allah. So Allah is, rationalizing with us and convincing us there is an existence of God. These things don't happen by itself. And we all know the famous story during the Prophet ﷺ, when Mu'adh bin Jabal was sent by the Prophet to Yemen. He was asked, how will you judge? I will judge according to the book of Allah. What if it's not in the book of Allah? Then Mu'adh says, I will use the tradition of the Prophet. What if it's not in the tradition of the Prophet? Then he says, I'll strive to form an opinion based on ijtihad. In another narrative, in the Battle of Badr, Muslim army decided to camp on a water well when they first encountered the first water well, so that the army can have water. And then a companion by name Hubab bin Mundhir came to the Prophet and asked him, the choice of the well, is it by the decree of the God or is it your decision? Here, a companion, you could have said, Sami'na wa atana, we hear and obey. He chose to talk to the Prophet and ask him, is it a decree of God or is it your decision? Then proceeds, the Prophet says, it is my decision, but then he says that perhaps not the best decision because you want to go to the well closest to the enemy and close off all the other wells to cut our water supply. The point of this is that there are plenty of examples in the Quran and in the Seerah that shows us that this critical thinking is ingrained in part of our faith. Let me give you reasons what happens when we don't follow it. Why did we come to the stagnation? Somewhere happened between 13th century. Let me tell you the story of paper and the printing press. It's a really sad story. The story of paper came to the Muslim world somewhere in the 8th century, during the time of Abbasid Mansur. There was a small town near the border of China. There was a battle, and two of the soldiers were captured as prisoners of war. Two among them knew how to make paper. Remember this, 8th century. They find a prisoner that knows how to make paper. And at the time, the Muslims tell these two prisoners, we will free you provided you teach us how to make paper. And Muslims take this notion of a paper and decide that they want to, the habit of transcribing knowledge, Quran and Hadith. They take it to the whole new level. They figure out how to manufacture paper better. They come up with the concept of a book. They create papers, one top of other. Until then, they used to write on leather sheets. And remember, printing press is still not there. They're still writing by hand. The whole notion of a ream, which is a bundle of paper, come from the Arabic word rizma, which means bundle. So here we are in the peak of the civilization. When we come upon new things, we embrace it. We use it to our advantage. And fast forward to 15th century. Gutenberg discovers printing press. We're already beginning the decline of the Muslim Ummah. The printing press all over the Europe. It comes to Haiti, in American shores, in Haiti, in Hawaii, all these places of printing press. Who was the dominant Muslim power? Ottomans. What did? They do a fatwa to say that if anyone is caught with a printing press, they will be summarily killed. And the tragedy is that this was in 15th century. The printing press would come to the Muslim land through Napoleon when he came to Egypt in 1798. Good 5 centuries when the rest of the world was using the printing press and spreading the knowledge. The printing press was probably the most significant innovation the humankind had up until then. Because it sparked the Western civilization and the modernity because access to knowledge became so much easier. I can go on with many examples. In the 13th century, a Syrian physicist by the name of Ibn al-Nafis first proposed the theory of blood circulation. Almost 400 years before William Harvey, who is credited with discovery of the systematic circulation of the blood. Al-Nafis can only theorize about the blood circulation because the dissection of the body was prohibited according to fatwa of the scholars at the time. Not him, nobody that had access to the knowledge can take that theory forward and prove it is to be real. And it took a Westerner 400 years for this and get the credit for it. The whole area of medicine, when French set up the medical college, they faced huge challenges because our scholars prohibited autopsy. How can you teach medicine if people that are studying medicine are not allowed to practice autopsy? So the ruler, Muhammad Ali Pasha, who was credited with modernizing Egypt, he introduced autopsy in a very clever way. First, he asked his students to cut animals and then use the dead bodies of slaves. And over time, ease this whole aspect of being able to use autopsy to learn so that people can treat living people. The reasons for all of this is our resistance to change. We immediately take a point of view that anything new must be haram, and not trusting our intellect to analyze the problems and apply Islamic principles to draw conclusions that benefit us. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa barik wa sallim alayhi wa sallam. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. So the topic that I went over today is critical thinking and reason guided by faith. I said three things. First, critical thinking and reasoning is very much part of our faith. Ability to reason doesn't make us weaker Muslims, and gave many examples both from the Quran and from the Sunnah where we're encouraged to apply critical thinking. And second, I pointed out the real consequences for us to stop applying critical thinking and how it took us from those that were the primary contributors to the civilization to where we are today. And I give you statistics of the contribution of the Muslims to the world civilization today. And I did so in the spirit of and looking at our past and making sure that we learn how it is that we can apply that to get a better future for ourselves and for the rest of the humanity. And finally, as I conclude with my last point, to make it personal for all of us. We are afraid to exercise critical thinking because we fear we can make mistakes. We think that the safest course for us is to stick to what we know from a historical perspective, even though the problems we face today are vastly different than what was experienced by those who lived before us. It's very hard today to understand Ibn Taymiyyah, rahmatullah alayhi, without understanding the context in which he lived. When there is an issue, our first instinct immediately perhaps is that I'm not going to think, I'm going to ask perhaps somebody, and it turns to probably an imam that I'm going to ask. As Tariq Ramadan would say in his book Radical Reform, both religious and subject matter experts must have authority on matters that are outside the realm of the rituals. It doesn't absolve us from doing our own homework. We just cannot abdicate our responsibility to think through the issues and say that I'm going to talk to X, Y, and Z to get an answer to the problem. Finally, we also have to make sure that we are able to engage in the society where there are diverse points of view. As I said, we live in a world of ideas. We're no longer fighting with sticks and bows or even bombs. It is a world of ideas. Particularly in the Western world, you can win an argument through logic and through rational arguments and through civic engagement. And to make sure that as we engage with our youth, that we are having this dialogue with them, that we are able to answer their question, because how they grow up is very different than how we are brought up. And as I think about civic engagement, I want to call out that we sort of live in a time where in a week from now, there's primaries happening in Washington State, and those of you who are citizens can exercise your right to make sure that you are voting in the primaries. I know many times if it's not a presidential election, we don't try to participate. There are many issues that affect us that are addressed through this political process that we have to engage. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide us to what is right and help us to follow it. I also ask you, anything good that I said, it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If anything that you disagree or you think is wrong, it's from your own self, and ask for your forgiveness for the shortcomings. We pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to be better Muslims, unite us, help us to solve the problems of the world, and be contributors to the humanity in the same way we were several centuries ago. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa aqim as-salah.